In this video, I'm going to be building a 1/12 scale scene inside this Christmas Advent calendar. The calendar itself is from The Works UK. At this moment in time, it's currently out of stock, but I will leave the link in the description box below. The inside aperture of this box is around 9.5 inches square, and the outside frame measures around about 14 inches. The first step for me was to create this window to go into the center of my scene. I put this file together using Cricut Design Space, and I cut out 3 layers of each using Cricut Craft Board, and then I laminated them together using Zig 2-way glue. I've also made this window file public on my Cricut Design Space page, so please feel free to go and use it as you wish. I wanted to give this window some paint effects, so to strengthen the piece and give it more of a wooden texture, I covered the entire thing in super glue. I smoothed it out with a piece of plastic and I left it aside for about an hour to cure. To create the back wall of the log cabin, I'm using some inexpensive chipboard from Amazon. It is 1.5mm thick and it comes in A4 sheets. The inside aperture of this calendar is 9.5 inch square, so I had to piece a couple of pieces together for me to create that whole wall. After I traced the outline of the window onto the chipboard, I then marked 1/4 of an inch on the inside of those lines. I then cut that out, and then that left me with a lip for the window to sit onto. To create the look of wooden slats on the log cabin wall, I scored lines at each 1/2 inch mark using a scoreboard. To lay the floor, I used jumbo popsicle sticks and 2 coffee stir sticks. Now on this project, I wouldn't have actually laid a floor, as you don't really see it because it is covered with the daybed and the bookshelves. However, how the front of this calendar is glued on, it does leave a slight lip, so I did need to raise the floor to take that away. This calendar is going to be a birthday gift for my best friend, and I'm basing this cabin off of her own log cabin out in the mountains in Norway. The majority of cabins that I've ever been in, I've always had this natural wood on the walls, and so I decided to stick with that aesthetic, and so I painted it in a burnt umber, and then I gave it a dry brushing of this lighter brown just to give it a slightly aged wooden effect. To make this wall sit slightly off of the back of the actual calendar, I'm using these bamboo sticks, and that is going to create a profile which is then going to help me create some depth when I use an image at the back of my window. Now that my window has had plenty of time to cure, I want to start creating a crackle effect. To get that effect, I'm using matte Mod Podge. I don't lay it too thickly, I don't lay it too thinly, and then before that has time to dry, I took it outside and sprayed it with some chalk paint. As that chalk paint dries, it shrinks and it creates the most beautiful, tiny, delicate crackle effect. To bring out a little bit more depth in the window frame and to bring out a little bit more of the crackle effect, I mixed together 2 shades of grey chalk pastels. I then worked that into the frame and into some of the crackle, and then I seal everything up with a layer of matte Mod Podge. To create the handles for the window, I used some copper wire. I bent one end at a 90-degree angle. I then threaded a crimp bead, then a regular bead, then another crimp bead, and then the end I bent again at a 90-degree angle. Once I was happy with the positioning, I glued that into place. I then painted it with black paint, and then I gave it a dry brushing with some gunmetal. This product I've had for a few years now. However, I believe that this company is no longer in business, so unfortunately I can't leave you the link. For the view looking out of the window, I whittled it down to these 2 images. Both photos are taken at Inga's cabin. The top one is a side view of the cabin as you approach it, and the bottom photo, which is the photo that I decided to use, is a photo taken from the window looking out onto the porch area of the cabin. To create the furniture for the log cabin, I created them on the creative space for Xtool. I cut them out on the laser cutter using 1.5mm plyboard for the bookshelves and the daybed, and then for the decorative trim I used 1mm MDF. After I built the daybed, I realized that I glued my seat and my front the wrong way around, which meant that I then had to cut the backrest in half as the profile then stuck out a little bit too much. I then used some coffee stir sticks for me to create the back wooden slats for the daybed backrest. Once the glue has had a chance to set up, I paint the furniture in burnt umber, and then for the bookshelves I paint the interior in a really nice warm grey coloured emulsion. To create a slightly rustic effect on the exterior of the bookshelves, I use this Vallejo chipping medium. Now, I've never used this product before this project, so I wasn't sure how thick or how thinly I was supposed to apply it. However, I just did a mixture of thick and thin applications, and once that had dried, I then painted over it with that same warm grey emulsion, and then once that had dried, I then used sellotape, which then lifted off areas of the emulsion to then show you the underneath layer of paint, as though paint had over time from wear and tear had just chipped away from the wood. To carry on with my rustic distressing, I then took an emery board and I lightly sanded off some of the paint from the drawer fronts and from the top of the seat. After I took away some of that top layer of paint, I then sealed everything up with the walnut wood varnish to protect it, and then I went over again with a light sanding, just again to knock it back to give me that warm, worn-in rustic feel. To create the curtain pole, which is going to hold the garland in the window, I used a wooden dowel. I then painted it in more burnt umber, and then I used copper wire to create the curtain pole brackets. I wound the wire around each end of the bracket 3 or 4 times. I super glued that into place, and then that then gave me something to hold the curtain pole into place. For the garland, I used this 1/12 scale dollhouse garland. I think I got this off of Etsy a long time ago. But to create the garland, I just wound it around my pole into a shape that I could start off with, and then I super glued that into place. I then used some white acrylic paint to create the faux snow effect. For the fairy lights, I'm using these lights which are for wine bottles. I cut off the actual light itself because the batteries in these lights, they never last very long. But I do wire these lights to a regular battery pack. Once I cut the wire off, I was then able to wind the wire around the garland to evenly disperse the light bulbs. With the lights now in place, I can attach the curtain pole to the top of the window and thread the wire for the lights throughout to the back of the calendar. Then I was able to solder the lights to a battery pack. To decorate the window garland, I'm using this string of fake fairy lights which I got from Temu earlier on this year, and I'm using the red, the white and the blue bulbs to imitate the colours of the Norwegian flag. To create the window seat cushion, I'm using 1.5mm foam board, and then for the cushioned part of it, I use the thick foam that you would typically use in bag making. The day that I was making this window seat, Inga was actually at her log cabin and she sent me a video of something to do with her cat. And then I noticed that on the back part of her window seat, she has a patchwork quilt. And then I remembered that I actually have this fabric which is of patchwork, which I was going to use in a different Christmas project altogether. When I looked at it, I realised that this actually has red polka dots on it, which is iconic to Inga. She wears a lot of red polka dots. If I hadn't spoken to her that morning, then it would have been just a plain linen cushion cover, which would have been nice. However, this though is perfect for Inga and her log cabin. To create the cushions for the window seat, I'm using the freezer paper technique. If you're unfamiliar with that, that's where you cut a piece of fabric, in my case I'm using some white cotton, to the size of paper that your printer will take, and then you iron it onto the freezer paper. That then enables you to run that fabric through your printer and transfer any image that you need onto your fabric. The Christmas images that I'm using for this project are actually Inga's own artwork. Inga is a professional artist, and a fun thing about these cushions is that she actually sells real life merchandise of her paintings, and one of them is cushions. She does mugs, calendars, all of those types of things, as well as the actual artwork itself. I also had some red polka dot fabric, which funnily enough was left over from a project of when I made a portrait doll of Inga a few years ago, and so to tie in with the polka dot on the blanket, I made some polka dot cushions. To decorate the shelves, I routed through all of my 3D printed objects and general dollhouse miniature objects that I have. When I 3D print for projects, I always 3D print multiples of each item because they don't always print right, or they may not print at all. And it's always nice to have that spare one because you never know if you might need it or not. The very first item which I pulled out of this collection was a miniature witch. Now, in a log cabin in Norway, you always have to have your cabin witch, so she hangs right above the window on this project. I also have things like a gnome that came out with one leg missing, so I was able to use it in this project rather than it go into the bin at some point. In Norwegian Christmas folklore, they don't have Father Christmas. They have these small gnome-like creatures which are called Nisa. So there are loads of Nisa scattered around this project. Also, a very important item would be the waffle iron, and to save time on the video, I painted these miniatures off camera. Me and Inga have been best friends for 23 years now, so as you can imagine, there were many photos that I had to go through to make it into this project. There are also two photos there of Cher, which may seem quite random. The first photo was a photo that I took of Cher at her concert in 2019, and she's staring straight at me, which was amazing. And the second photo is of Cher's Believe album. The reason for those photos going into this project is that we both love Cher, and it is tradition that whenever I arrive into Norway, we get drunk on wine or vodka filled with gold leaf, and we dance and sing until the early hours of the morning to the Believe album. Also quite a bit of George Michael as well, for good measure. To make the frames for these photos, I use my digital calipers and I put in the measurements onto the creative space for X tool, and then I cut that out of 1mm MDF. To imitate the glass, I'm just using some wide sellotape or packaging tape. I then stick that down, and then I painted the MDF frames with brown paint, and then I just glue that on top, and then I cut them out with the craft blade. As a shelf filler, we always need books, so I printed out some books at different sizes. I didn't end up using many of these books. Originally, I did have some on the top shelf as well as the bottom shelf. However, I decided to take those down as Inga's favourite author is Stephen King, and I came across some printable miniature Stephen King books on Etsy, so I bought those and I added those to the top shelf later on in the project instead. A very important component to any log cabin stay is alcohol. Earlier on this year, I did a haul on Temu and I bought some wine bottles, and these work perfectly in this project. This jar is filled with mosses that I use in my miniature projects. I collected them last year when I visited Inga and we went to the log cabin, and the grass which I'm using here, or the moss that I'm using here, is something which they call troll's beard, and it hangs off of the trees and it looks really awesome. I'm going to Norway in less than 2 weeks to see Inga, so I'll be taking this calendar with me. However, I'm not sure if we are going to the log cabin this year, so if not, I won't be able to top up my collection of this awesome product. But I do have so much of it, I don't think I'm going to run out of it anytime soon. To decorate the front of the calendar, I first gave the drawer fronts a base coat of the same burnt umber that I've used throughout the project. Once that had dried, I gave it a dry brushing of a very light coloured grey acrylic paint. That gives a very festive, rustic paint finish, almost like a silver birch or something like that. Once that had dried, I then used an emery board and I sanded away the edges just to give it a more rustic feel, and I repeated that process on the frame of the calendar as well. Once that had dried, I sealed in the paint with a thin layer of a furniture wax. To decorate the front of the drawers with the numbers, I used these wooden rounds which I purchased at the works. They were £2 per packet and they are real wood and they come pre-stamped. So since losing my voice three and a half months ago, this is my first voiceover in that amount of time. So now that I have a voice back, I'd like to say thank you very much for spending your time with me today. If you aren't already subscribed, please subscribe, give the video a like. I will see you very soon. I hope you have a fantastic day. Bye.